He gave me 10 feet of freedom, and it was enough to last a lifetime. The sun blazed across a sky so wide it felt endless, burning down on the wire fences and wooden guard towers of Camp Hearn, Texas. Dust hung in the air, still as glass, while a dozen German women stood near the corral, bareheaded, silent, squinting at the light. They had worked all morning in the heat, mending uniforms for soldiers who had once been their enemies. But that afternoon, everything changed. The gate creaked open, and 3 cowboys rode in from the fields, their horses kicking up red dirt. The prisoners froze, staring. They had heard stories about these men. The Americans who could rope a steer faster than you could draw a breath, the ones who lived free, wild, and fearless. One of them, a tall, sunburned ranch hand named Jake Rourke, dismounted and tied his horse to the fence. His eyes scanned the group, landing on a young woman standing apart from the rest. Her name was Greta Fischer, 23, from Munich, a Luftwaffe clerk captured in Italy. She looked away when he met her gaze. In her world, men like him were supposed to be monsters. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavy enough to crush the sound from your lungs. Then Jake did something no one expected. He walked straight toward her, stopped just a few feet away, and extended his hand. "You ever been on a horse before?" he asked quietly. She blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. Around them, guards tensed. Prisoners whispered in German. The camp captain stepped out of his office, shading his eyes against the sun. Jake waited. Finally, Greta shook her head. He smiled, not mockingly, but gently, and before anyone could object, he reached out, placed his hands around her waist, and lifted her effortlessly onto his horse. The world went silent. The prisoners gasped. Even the wind seemed to stop. For 10 heartbeats, the camp didn't breathe. Greta sat frozen in the saddle, her fingers gripping the leather horn, expecting a blow, a shout, a punishment. But none came. Jake just said, "Hold on tight. He won't bite." The horse snorted and stepped forward, circling slowly in the corral. For the first time in years, she felt motion that wasn't from marching or transport trucks. It was freedom disguised as a ride. When the horse stopped, she looked down at Jake, her eyes wide, a single tear cutting through the dust on her cheek. He tipped his hat and said softly, "You'll be fine, ma'am." In that instant, something invisible shifted inside every person watching. The war, the hatred, the propaganda, all of it cracked. And for the briefest moment, under a Texas sun, the impossible happened. Mercy felt stronger than victory. Months before that silent afternoon in Texas, Greta Fischer had crouched in the dark belly of a German truck, rattling through the ruins of northern Italy. The convoy moved at night, headlights dimmed, engines muffled. Rumors whispered among the women inside that they were being sent west across the ocean to an American camp. Some said it was mercy, others said it was a death sentence. The radio in the driver's cabin still played fragments of the Führer's speeches, shouting about honor, endurance, and victory. But everyone knew the war was collapsing. Cities were dust. Their brothers were gone. The Reich was falling apart, one bomb at a time. Propaganda had promised them everything. It had shown posters of proud German women standing beside tanks, smiling beside flags. But in those final months, the stories changed. Leaflets warned of Yankee cruelty, that Americans starved prisoners, that women captives were paraded through streets, that no mercy was given to those who had served the Reich. Fear became the last currency of a dying empire. When Greta was captured outside Naples, she expected the worst. The American soldier who found her shouted in a language she didn't understand, his rifle raised. She froze, trembling. He looked young, no older than her brother, and after a moment, he lowered the weapon. He handed her a canteen of water and said only one word she understood: drink. It was the first crack in everything she'd been taught. The journey to America took weeks across the Atlantic. The ship was packed with prisoners, German officers, medics, and a handful of women who had worked in offices or hospitals. The guards were watchful, but not cruel. They gave out food, bandaged wounds, even shared cigarettes when the nights were calm. One morning, a storm rolled in, and the waves hammered the deck until everyone was soaked and shivering. A sailor wrapped his coat around one of the prisoners, muttering, "You'll freeze before we reach land." Greta never forgot that moment. It wasn't kindness, she understood. It was confusion. Why would enemies help her live? When the ship finally reached the Gulf of Mexico, she saw land that stretched forever, flat, sunlit, and foreign. The prisoners were herded into trains marked POW and rolled north through endless fields and towns where children waved at them. No hatred, no jeering, just curious faces. When the train stopped at a siding surrounded by barbed wire and cattle fences, the sign read, Camp Hearn, Texas. Greta stepped onto dry earth that smelled of cedar and heat. She expected armed guards with snarling dogs. Instead, she saw men in cowboy hats tipping them politely and calling out, "Welcome to Texas, ladies." The word sounded strange, almost wrong. She whispered to another prisoner, "If this is captivity, it's not the one we were warned about." But inside, she felt more afraid than ever, because if the enemy wasn't what she expected, then maybe everything else she believed was wrong. 2. By 1944, the United States was running one of the largest prisoner-of-war systems in human history. Nearly 500,000 Axis soldiers, Germans, Italians, and Japanese were scattered across more than 500 camps across the American heartland. Texas alone held more than 70,000. The vast ranch lands and open terrain made escape nearly impossible. And yet, these places were unlike any prison the world had known. Built fast but organized with military precision, American POW camps reflected not cruelty but efficiency. The War Department had issued strict rules. The Geneva Convention would be followed to the letter. Every prisoner would be housed, fed, and treated according to rank. Officers had separate quarters. Medical care was mandatory. Abuse was forbidden. American policy wasn't born of sentiment. It was logistical logic. A content prisoner caused fewer problems and required fewer guards, but in practice, it produced something far more profound. Camp Hearn in Texas stood as a strange fusion of discipline and freedom. Barracks lined the perimeter in neat rows, their whitewashed wood gleaming under the punishing sun. The smell of fresh bread drifted from the kitchen every morning, mingling with the dry scent of hay and leather from the stables nearby. Prisoners could grow vegetables, paint murals, even stage theater plays if they wanted. They earned small wages for their labor, redeemable at the camp canteen for cigarettes or Coca-Cola. To the German women arriving from the broken ruins of Europe, it looked unreal. There were no iron walls, no shouting guards, no dogs. Instead, they saw wooden fences and soldiers who said, "Please and thank you." Some of the women were placed in sewing units, mending uniforms for American troops. Others worked in the fields, planting crops that would feed both sides of the war effort. The camp's commander, Major William R. Walker, believed that discipline could coexist with dignity. He told his staff, "If we treat them like beasts, we create beasts. But if we treat them like humans, they'll act like it." His approach spread quickly through the ranks of guards, many of whom were young Texans drafted from local ranches. They wore the same sun-faded uniforms they had before the war, Stetsons swapped for steel helmets, and they brought with them a sense of fairness that had little to do with ideology and everything to do with culture. The result was something paradoxical, a POW camp that felt more like a frontier town than a prison. There were fences, yes, but they stood in wide fields where the horizon swallowed fear. When the prisoners first saw the guards on horseback, they whispered to each other, "So this is America," Greta wrote in her diary. "We were ready to meet monsters. Instead, we met men who laughed in the sun." None of them realized it yet, but this blend of order and openness would do more to defeat Nazism in their hearts than any Allied bomb ever could. The first week at Camp Hearn was silent. The German women worked, ate, and slept in near total quiet, still half convinced that the friendliness around them was some elaborate trick. The guards, mostly farmhands turned soldiers, found this eerie. Texans weren't used to silence. They filled their days with talk, jokes, and the rhythm of labor. But the prisoners' eyes always followed them, cautious, measuring. Then one afternoon, something changed. Jake Rourke, a 5-year-old rancher from Llano County, was helping repair a fence near the women's barracks when he noticed one of them sitting apart from the rest, drawing on the back of a cardboard box. It was Greta. She hunched over, shading with a stub of pencil, oblivious to everything around her. Curious, Jake stepped closer and peered over her shoulder. On the cardboard was the outline of a horse in motion, muscles tense, head high, captured with startling accuracy. He whistled softly. "You draw real good, miss." She looked up, startled. No American had spoken to her directly since arrival. "Danke," she managed, unsure if it was safe to speak. He smiled. "Means thank you, right?" She nodded. Jake squatted beside her, tracing the air with his finger. "You ever seen one run for real out in the open?" Greta shook her head. "Only soldiers' horses, not free ones." He pointed toward the open pasture beyond the barbed wire. "We run them out there after supper. You should watch sometime. They don't know they're the lucky ones." Then he tipped his hat and walked off. That short exchange rippled through the barracks that night. The women whispered about it long after lights out. "He spoke to you?" one asked in disbelief. "And you answered?" "Yes," Greta whispered, and he smiled. For the guards, curiosity turned mutual. These weren't the propaganda villains they had imagined either. Instead of sneering Nazis, they saw frightened young women who flinched at raised voices and worked hard without complaint. The camp chaplain wrote in his report, "They seem astonished by decency, as if kindness were a new language they are just learning." Soon, the invisible wall between captives and captors began to crack. Guards would tip their hats when passing groups of prisoners. The women began returning greetings, awkwardly at first, then naturally. A few guards left small gifts, an apple here, a folded newspaper there. The women responded with hand-sewn handkerchiefs or sketches, and when the ranch guards rode their horses near the camp, the women gathered by the fence to watch, their laughter breaking through the silence for the first time. Greta wrote that evening, "They ride like they were born on the wind, and yet they smile at us, the defeated, as if we are worth smiling at." None of the men knew it yet, but that simple curiosity, the decision to treat the enemy as someone worth knowing, would lead to the moment when one cowboy would change everything with a single forbidden act of compassion. By midsummer, the heat over Camp Hearn shimmered like glass. Work started before sunrise to beat the blaze. The German women spent their mornings stitching canvas, washing uniforms, or tending vegetable plots fenced near the stables. But on Sundays, the camp loosened its rhythm. Guards played cards under the shade. Horses were brushed and walked, and the cowboys, those born riders in uniform, sometimes staged friendly contests just to break the monotony. It was on one such Sunday that everything changed. The guards had set up a makeshift rodeo behind the stables. A dozen soldiers and prisoners gathered along the fence line to watch. The horses pranced nervously, the smell of dust and sweat filling the air. Jake Rourke was among the riders, his Stetson tilted low, the sun glinting off his belt buckle. From behind the wire, Greta and a few other women watched, clutching the fence posts, eyes wide. When Jake's turn came, he mounted a bay gelding named Whiskey, a horse known for his stubborn streak. The animal snorted, pawed the dirt, and shot forward the moment the gate opened. Jake barely stayed seated, the crowd whooping and laughing. After a tense minute, he brought the horse to a stop, dust rising around him like smoke. Someone shouted, "Let the German ladies have a turn." The laughter that followed was light-hearted, but the guards nearby froze. Jake dismounted, grinning, and scanned the fence. His eyes found Greta standing still, face flushed from the sun. She had been sketching again, capturing his ride with the same sharp lines as before. Jake walked toward the fence, holding the horse's reins loosely. "Miss Fisher," he called, surprising her by using her name. "Ever been in a saddle?" The women around her gasped. Greta shook her head quickly. "9? Never." Tom hesitated, then said quietly, "Would you like to?" For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The captain overseeing the event frowned, hand tightening on his clipboard. Regulations forbade any unnecessary contact with prisoners, but curiosity, laughter, and the easy chaos of the moment hung in the air. Jake made his decision. He walked to the fence, opened the small gate, and extended his hand. "Come on, he don't bite." Greta stepped forward as if in a trance. The crowd went dead silent. Even the horse stilled, sensing something different. Jake took her hand gently, then without strain, lifted her up into the saddle. Her breath caught. The prisoners stared. The guards stared. The camp itself seemed to pause. She sat awkwardly at first, gripping the saddle horn, Jake rested a steadying hand on the reins. "Just breathe," he said. "You're safe." He led the horse in a slow circle inside the corral. The motion was hypnotic. The creak of leather, the rhythm of hooves, the whisper of wind through dry grass. Greta's fear softened into something else. For the first time since her capture, she felt alive. When they stopped, Jake looked up at her and smiled. "See? Told you he was gentle." She tried to answer but couldn't. Instead, tears rolled down her cheeks, carving clean lines through the dust on her face. She climbed down slowly, her knees trembling. Around them, no one spoke. Later in her diary, she wrote, "The moment he lifted me, I stopped being a prisoner. For 10 seconds, I remembered I was human." The silence that followed lingered for minutes, long after Greta's boots touched the ground again. Even the cicadas, loud and relentless all summer, seemed to pause. The air inside Camp Hearn hung still, heavy with disbelief. No one, neither guard nor prisoner, could quite process what they'd witnessed. A German woman, POW, enemy of the United States, sitting astride an American horse lifted there by a cowboy in uniform. The camp captain, Major Walker, had seen everything. For a long moment, he said nothing. The other guards waited for the inevitable explosion of discipline, but instead he exhaled through his nose, adjusted his cap, and muttered, "Well, hell, so long as she didn't fall." Then he walked away. The rest of the camp stayed frozen, as if afraid that breathing too loudly might undo the fragile magic that had just taken place. Greta stood near the fence, still trembling. The warmth of the horse lingered against her palms. Across from her, Jake Rourke tipped his hat and said softly, "Didn't mean no harm, ma'am. Just thought you might like to know how freedom feels." She nodded, unable to find words. That night, rumors swept through the camp faster than wildfire across dry grass. Some prisoners whispered that it was a stunt for propaganda. Others insisted the cowboy would be court-martialed. But when the next morning came, Jake was still there, smiling, drinking his coffee, same as always. And the guards didn't seem angry. They seemed changed. The women, too, began to change. Their posture straightened. Their eyes met those of their guards without flinching. The air of weary defeat that had clung to them since capture began to fade, replaced by something unfamiliar. Dignity. The simple act of being lifted onto that horse had done what no speech or sermon could have. It had restored their sense of humanity. Greta, once quiet and withdrawn, became the bridge between the two worlds. She started teaching the guards German phrases, sketching portraits of the horses, even translating songs. When she laughed, the sound was strange at first, like something long buried finding its way back to the surface. Jake didn't talk much about the moment afterward. To him, it hadn't been a statement, just an instinct. "Ain't right keeping people scared of sunlight," he said when asked, but deep down he knew something sacred had happened. The chaplain who visited the camp every week recorded the story in his journal. A cowboy lifted an enemy onto his horse, and the war stopped for a moment. He wrote, "No sermon I could preach would do more for the soul than that." When Major Walker eventually filed his report to headquarters, he made no mention of the incident. He simply noted morale improving steadily among female prisoners. No disciplinary issues. But word of the act spread far beyond the barbed wire. Guards told their families back home. Ranchers passing through shared it over dinner tables and in small-town cafes. "Did you hear about the cowboy who put a German woman on his horse?" they'd say, shaking their heads in wonder. In a world consumed by destruction, that tiny sliver of grace felt like defiance. Years later, when historians interviewed former prisoners of Camp Hearn, nearly every one of them mentioned that day. Some couldn't recall the cowboy's name. Others remembered the horse's color wrong, but all agreed on one thing. The moment he lifted her, the camp itself seemed to hold its breath, and when it exhaled, the war felt just a little smaller. In her diary, Greta wrote only one sentence that night. "He gave me 10 feet of freedom, and it was enough to last a lifetime." By the end of that week, Camp Hearn no longer felt the same. Something unseen but powerful had shifted in the air, spreading from one heart to another like a quiet contagion. The guards were still guards, the prisoners still prisoners, but the sharp edge between them had dulled. The women began humming while they worked. German folk songs carried faintly through the hot Texas wind. The guards, curious, sometimes joined in with their own tunes, old cowboy ballads and swing melodies. Two languages, two melodies, blending into something that wasn't quite either. Greta became the center of it all without meaning to. Her sketch of the moment, Jake lifting her onto Whiskey's back, was passed secretly among prisoners, then among the guards. Someone tacked it to the wall of the mess hall. Beneath it, someone else scrawled in pencil, "Not all fences keep people apart." When the camp's chaplain saw it, he left it there. He said later, "Some sermons are better drawn than spoken." But not everyone approved. One morning, an officer from headquarters arrived unannounced. He'd heard whispers of fraternization, an offense that could mean reassignment or worse. The camp tensed as he inspected the barracks, his boots crunching over gravel, his face unreadable. At lunch, he sat across from Major Walker, both men eating in silence until the officer finally asked, "Is it true one of your men put a German woman on a horse?" Walker didn't flinch. "Yes, sir." "And you didn't discipline him?" Walker set down his fork. "No, sir. I didn't see the need. No harm was done." The officer frowned. "You understand how this looks?" Walker leaned back. "I do, but I also understand how it feels. The men sleep easier. The women work better. No trouble, no fights, no hate. You want me to punish the one act that made this place human again?" The officer said nothing for a long moment, then he nodded once and finished his meal. He left the next morning without writing a single report. From then on, no one mentioned the incident again in official channels, but everyone remembered. It became camp lore, a story told in quiet tones during late-night watches and whispered prayers. For the women, it was proof that mercy still existed. For the cowboys, it was proof that decency didn't need permission. Greta's health improved. She smiled more. Sometimes she'd stand by the fence at sunset, watching the horses run, her hair catching the red glow of the dying sun. Jake would wave from the stables, and she'd wave back, a small gesture carrying more weight than either could admit. In her letters home, letters that would be censored but still carefully read by German censors, she wrote of strange kindness. She told her mother, "They treat us not as enemies, but as people who have lost our way." The censors let it pass, not realizing the quiet revolution those words carried. In the camp's records, 1944 went down as a peaceful year. No riots, no escapes, no acts of defiance. But among those who lived it, it was remembered for something else entirely. The year the fences didn't feel so high. Years later, a surviving guard would tell a local reporter, "That cowboy didn't break a rule. He broke the war for just a minute." And maybe that's all anyone really needed. Winter came late to Texas that year, soft and dry, with mornings that glowed gold over the frost-dusted prairie. Camp Hearn quieted with the cold. Less work, fewer visitors, more time for thoughts that had nowhere to go. For the German women, homesickness sharpened. For the guards, the war began to feel like something far away, fading like a storm on the horizon. Greta spent her evenings in the recreation hall, writing letters beneath a dim bulb. She wrote in German, her words careful, almost musical. The censors would read every line, but she no longer wrote to escape. She wrote to remember. "Dearest Mutter," she began one letter. "Today, the cowboy let me feed the horses. Their breath came out in clouds. I thought of our farm, of father in the fields. The Americans call this land God's country, and I believe it. It is too large to hate anyone for long." The guards learned to leave her be when she wrote. Some of them even brought her extra paper. Private Jenkins, a farm boy from Oklahoma, once asked her what she wrote about. She smiled and said, "Freedom, but in small words." Meanwhile, the story of Camp Hearn's kindness began to travel farther than anyone expected. Red Cross representatives wrote glowing reports. Photographs of prisoners smiling beside guards were quietly circulated in newspapers back home. A war-weary public needed hope. And stories of compassion, even between enemies, sold better than tales of destruction. Greta's diary entries from that time paint a vivid picture. She wrote of cattle drives passing near the camp, of cowboys tossing their hats and waving as they rode by. Sometimes she wrote of the nights when the guards played harmonica under the stars, and the women listened through the barracks walls. "The music sounds like longing," she wrote. "But maybe all longing sounds like America." Her bond with Jake Rourke remained wordless most days. They rarely spoke beyond pleasantries. Rules were still rules, but their silences carried the weight of understanding. Once he left an apple on the fence post by her workbench. She returned it the next day, polished and carved with a small horse on one side. Neither mentioned it again. The camp's chaplain noticed. "There's a holiness in small mercies," he said during Sunday service, eyes sweeping over both guards and prisoners. Wars end faster when people remember each other's faces. By early 1945, the war in Europe was clearly nearing its end. Newspapers reached the camp with headlines of Allied victories. Some prisoners wept quietly at night. Others stared at the ceiling, afraid to imagine what surrender might mean. For Greta, the thought of going home brought confusion, not relief. She had begun to believe that captivity had freed something inside her that Germany had long buried. One morning as she worked mending horse tack, she asked Jake softly, "When this ends, do you think we will remember each other?" Jake thought for a long time. "If I forget, I reckon I don't deserve the memory." She smiled at that. Then she said something that surprised him. "When I go home, I will tell them Americans did not win with hate. They won with hands that built instead of destroyed." Jake didn't reply. He just tipped his hat, and they went back to work. That night, the camp radio crackled with news. Allied forces were crossing the Rhine. Germany's collapse was near. Outside, the horses shifted in their stalls, restless under a sky full of strange stars. On the morning of May 8th, 1945, the Texas wind carried something different through the camp. Stillness. No shouted orders, no hammering from the workshops, no sound at all except the faint hiss of the radio inside the mess hall. The German women stood clustered around the loudspeaker, the guards behind them, both groups silent as the broadcast began. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces." The words dropped like stones into the dry Texas dust. Greta froze, her hands trembling. Some of the women gasped, others broke into tears. One fell to her knees. Years of fear, pride, and exhaustion seemed to collapse all at once. Jake Rourke removed his hat and bowed his head. Major Walker, standing beside him, murmured quietly, "It's over." For the first time in years, no one in the camp felt like an enemy. The fences no longer mattered. The German women didn't know whether to weep or celebrate. Home had been reduced to rubble. Fathers, husbands, brothers, all might be gone. But in that moment, surrounded by cowboys and guards, they realized something else. They had survived, and survival in that strange Texas dawn felt like its own kind of victory. Later that morning, the guards brought food, extra rations, real coffee, and to everyone's surprise, bottles of Coca-Cola chilled in buckets of melted ice. Someone produced a radio playing Glenn Miller's "In the Mood." The melody drifted across the camp, and for the first time since captivity began, laughter rose without fear. Greta sat quietly, holding the bottle in both hands, staring at the way the sunlight caught the glass. It was absurd, she thought, to taste sweetness on the same day her country had died. Yet somehow it felt right. Jake walked over, offered her a small plate of bacon and biscuits, and said softly, "Breakfast, ma'am." She looked up, eyes glistening. "For peace?" "For peace." He nodded. She took a bite. Tears filled her eyes. It wasn't just food. It was a symbol of everything the war had tried to erase. Warmth, kindness, humanity. Around them, a few women began to hum. It started softly, a German lullaby. But then, an American guard joined in with the tune. Before long, the camp was alive with a strange harmony of two nations that had tried to destroy each other, now singing under the same sky. When the meal was over, Major Walker raised his cup and said simply, "No prisoners here today, just people." Greta wrote in her diary that night, "We drank their Coca-Cola and cried into their coffee. We thought defeat would be humiliation, but instead it tasted like forgiveness." As the sun dipped behind the mesquite trees, Jake walked the perimeter one last time before lights out. He found Greta by the fence, watching the horizon glow red and gold. "Guess you'll be heading home soon," he said. "Yes," she replied softly, "but part of me will stay here." He nodded, understanding without words. Then, hesitating, he reached up and handed her something. His old cowboy hat, the brim sweat-stained and frayed. "Keep it," he said, "so you don't forget Texas." She took it gently, pressing it to her chest. "I will never forget," she said. "Not Texas, not you." In the official reports filed later, May 8th was listed as VE Day, no incidents reported. But to those who lived it, it was something far more profound. The day enemies became human again. 2 months later, Camp Hearn began to empty. One by one, the trucks rolled out through the gates, carrying the German women toward repatriation ships on the East Coast. Each departure was quiet. No bands, no speeches, only the creak of wheels and the heavy air of farewells too deep for words. Greta stood beside the loading truck, holding her small suitcase and the worn cowboy hat Jake had given her. Around her, other women clutched similar keepsakes, drawings, trinkets, even a few hand-carved horses from the camp workshop. The guards lined up to see them off. For months, they had been watchmen. Now they looked like friends. When her turn came, Greta stepped forward and found Jake waiting by the gate. He looked awkward in his clean uniform, his hat missing. "Guess this is goodbye," he said. "For now," she replied, smiling faintly. "You taught me how to ride again, not just the horse, but life." He chuckled. Never thought a cowboy would end up teaching a German how to live. She took his hand briefly, just long enough to feel its warmth, and then climbed into the truck. As it rumbled away, Jake lifted his arm in one last wave. She waved back until the camp disappeared behind the dust. Back in Germany, Greta returned to ruins. Her town was unrecognizable, factories flattened, homes burned, her family scattered. Yet she carried Texas with her, the memory of open skies, of laughter, of people who had treated her not as a prisoner, but as a person. She began volunteering with local reconstruction efforts, teaching children English, and telling stories of the kindness she had seen. When asked why she spoke so gently of her captors, she answered simply, "Because they were never my captors. They were my teachers." Her diary from those years, preserved decades later in a museum in Bremen, includes an entry dated July 1945. "They beat us with no whips, conquered us without chains. They showed us strength without cruelty. I saw America not through its bombs, but through a cowboy's eyes, and what I saw was freedom." In Texas, Camp Hearn was dismantled by the end of 1946. The barracks were sold for lumber, the fences rusted away. Only the old horse corral remained, its posts bleached by the sun. Jake Rourke returned to ranch life, married, and raised a family. But every so often, when someone mentioned the war, he'd glance east and say, "I once met a German woman who rode better than most cowboys." Years passed. In 1962, a letter arrived at the ranch addressed to Mr. Jake Rourke, Texas, United States. Inside was a photograph, a woman standing in front of a rebuilt German farmhouse, wearing a sun hat with a familiar curve to the brim. On the back, written in careful English, were 4 words: "Still riding, still free." Jake never replied. He didn't need to. When he passed away years later, his grandson found that same photo framed above his desk. Beneath it, in Jake's rough handwriting, were the words, "The day we stopped being enemies. The war ended, but the memory endured, not of battlefields or bombs, but of a quiet morning in Texas, when a cowboy lifted a woman onto a horse, and the world just for a moment remembered its humanity." Because sometimes the greatest victories don't roar with cannons, they whisper with compassion. And in that whisper, history found its redemption.